Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy.
Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest today is going to talk about her experiences growing up and then what she's been doing as a clinical hypnotherapist and life coach since then to help other people. So, guest, if you would please just go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you for having me, Christine. My name is Stacia Aashnaa, and as you said, I'm a clinical hypnotherapist and an embodiment coach. And I guess to start, to share a little bit about me, uh, I grew up as the youngest of five children in a family where I experienced abuse, neglect, abandonment. It was complex trauma, which it means trauma over, spanning my entire childhood. And uh, those experiences, which required me to go through tremendous bouts of grief and depression and anxiety, shaped me to become somebody who is very passionate about healing myself so that I could live a normal functioning life.
Right.
Yeah. And then to when I was able to do that for myself, as I continue to be able to do that for myself, my passion to be able to help others grew. So that is what inspired me to get into the work that I do today and help people to return to themselves, to reclaim joy and happiness in their lives, and to live a life that is authentic to them.
Yeah. So one thing that's a little different about your story than other people I've talked to about the grieving and becoming, who your true self and so on, is this concept of generational grief. So tell us a bit about what that is and what it looks like.
Well, I can't remember if that was a term that I used or if you used it, but generational grief is describes my experience of and basically inheriting the grief that my mother was experiencing while she was pregnant with me. I was not a planned birth, and my father had actually had a vasectomy, and my mother became pregnant with me. The vasectomy didn't work, obviously,
You're meant to be.
and
I think you're meant to be the way I look at that.
it was somehow I was meant to come through. I wanted to live. That's how I see that now through a positive frame is like, I really wanted to come through and to be born. Um, I, so I was not planned. And my mother and father did not have a good, happy marriage. My father, was a very, lost soul. He had been a lifelong addict. His first drug was growing up on a farm in rural Michigan. He, at the age of 8, became addicted to huffing tractor fumes, which
Oh,
his older brother introduced him to. So you can only imagine what that must have done to his small body and brain, to damage him. And and then he became an alcoholic as a teenager. My parents met when they were both hippies in the 60s, and it was a time of free love. It was not a time of grounded like love of like really making conscious decisions for them. So the abuse towards my mother started immediately, physical abuse, and my mother chose to marry my father despite that because it was wrong to not get married at that time for her and her family system. There would have been too much shame for her to not marry. And she continued to have children with my father, and by the time she got pregnant with me, as I said, he had had a vasectomy, but she still became pregnant with me, so the vasectomy didn't work. Um, my mother, uh, my mother had during her pregnancy with me, she lost her father, who she was very, very close with, and her grandmother, who was her best friend. And those losses, on top of everything else that my mother was going through, had gone through in her life, put her into a state of just absolute grief the entire pregnancy. And my mother is a griever. Like when she grieves, it's not private or quiet. It is very overt, and lots of, just and who could blame her, like, for everything that she'd endured in her life too. I mean, she had a lot to grieve about. Um, but you could imagine like what that would be like to be a baby developing in my mother's body while she is going through all of this incredible grief. And my mother did see me as her angel child because I was not a planned birth. Um, but I realized later on, as I've been doing my own recovery work from my trauma, that I took on the job of being like the bearer of my mother's grief because she saw me as this gift, essentially, like this child that was going to come through and like take away her grief.
Right.
So I think we had almost this like soul contract where I came in to help my mother with her grief. Um, and I didn't realize that until much later, that so much of the grief, which I felt grief my entire life, and I've experienced a lot of loss, but the way that I grieve is big, like, and it's always felt like just a mountain. I've described it as a mountain of grief in my heart. Um, I didn't realize until more recently in my life that that was because it wasn't just my grief. This was my mother's grief as well that I was carrying. So I have been on the process and journey of unburdening myself from my mother's grief, and to settle into what feels like mine, which there is grief there, but it's very different. So that's
You
kind
can
of what I'm talking about.
you can tell the difference between the two in your thinking about it, or you're in your mind. You can tell this is me and this was mom.
I can tell the difference in my body.
Okay.
And in what I feel in my body. So I have an internal family systems therapist, and I myself do IFS with people. But when we are doing internal family systems therapy, we are looking at how we store emotions, experiences somatically in our body. And as I've like done this very nuanced work with myself, I've been able to feel into, yeah, what is mine? And sometimes it's like asking our bodies, does this belong to me? And that wisdom is there. It really is. If people trust their bodies and themselves, you can discern what's yours in terms of intergenerational trauma.
Right. Now, I
Yeah.
know, of course, as we introduced you as a clinical hypnotherapist as well as the embodiment coach. So is it through hypnotherapy that have been able to work through some of these grieving, whether it's the grief inherited from mom or your own?
Not hypnosis as much as IFS and somatic experiencing. So, I've specifically been working with IFS and SE, that's somatic experiencing, to help to distinguish and differentiate myself from that carried grief.
Is that something that a person would need to find, like a specialist to help them with, or, someone who would understand how that all works, or I mean, with the IFS and the SE, I mean, those sound like
Yeah.
something that would be extra trained in?
Yes. Yeah, those are, so you can go on to, obviously, if anybody's interested, they could reach out to me. But you can also go on to the IFS directory. You can just Google it and find their directory, and then also the somatic experiencing directory, and find practitioners and therapists who work with those modalities. Uh, and everybody has grief. And I think that if you're listening, you may be surprised that you probably are carrying some level of grief that is not yours. If anybody has done ancestral trauma work with themselves, just consider, what is it that your parents and their parents and their parents gone way back have been through. And most of our ancestors have endured incredible tragedies and lived with tremendous amounts of grief. And that kind of gets coded in the nervous systems and gets passed down. And there's more and more research coming out to prove that this does happen, that that intergenerational trauma is the real thing, that we can prove it. We can show that this really does happen.
Yeah.
So it's really, it can feel heavy to think, oh my gosh, I'm not just carrying my own grief, but also like potentially like my mother or somebody else's. But at the same time, it's very liberating. Like I felt like I was able to see that, this heaviness that I feel in my body that affects me and can, cause me to feel depressed more easily, for example, which depression is something I've always dealt with. Uh, that some of that has come on because of what I've carried, not because of what is authentically mine.
Okay. So in your work with the hypnosis and so on, do you typically work with clients that have grief issues, or is that kind of your niche, or how does that work?
It's not my niche. I work with I work with a variety of people, but I work with people who have trauma. And typically grief comes along with trauma, obviously. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a niche, but it generally always shows up to some extent. And, and, and it's, I really enjoy working with people when it comes to the topic of grief because, so many of us haven't been given the opportunity to really heal our grief, where we live in a society that, you lose somebody and then you take maybe a couple days off from work and then you go right back to work.
Yeah.
It's like, it's really, we don't, many of us don't live in societies or in culture where we're really supported through our grief.
Yeah, that's been a common theme in a lot of my podcasts with a lot of
Mhm.
different people who've had that same thing. And I always kind of talk about how, here in the United States, a lot of employers will give you your bereavement leave is like 3 days after someone
Oh,
passes. And it's like, anyway, I kind
yeah.
of think about, even if you're traveling, I guess that's okay just to get you there and back. But a lot of people getting
Right.
work after 3 days is, depending on your loss, is not feasible, not healthy.
I I lost my brother Jeremy when I was 15 and he died in a motorcycle accident when he was 28. And I remember it happened 2 weeks before I had to go back to school. It was like during my summer break. And I remember on that first day of school, I could not believe that I was expected to go to school. I just couldn't believe it. I was like, how is this possible that you expect me to go to school? Like everything in my life is completely changed. And I am not the same person I was
Yeah,
before. And how am I going to relate to any of my peers now?
yeah,
Because I am a totally different person now.
yeah,
Like everything changed. And at such a young age to go through that, um, it puts everything in perspective in a completely different way
yeah.
where, yeah, school did not feel feel like it mattered either. So yeah, I think it's unfortunate that so many of us go through these experiences and we're not supported through it. So when I work with people, we can go back and we can transform and heal those memories too. Because sometimes what happens is, I know I've experienced this in my family. There's a lot of stuck grief where the grief has not been able to. It's not that it's going to go away. It's that's not going to happen, right? But where it's like stuck and we are not able to move forward in our lives and to be able to, and I know that is even a tender thing because sometimes there's guilt about moving forward, uh, but but there's often what is called an incomplete response where people did not get to do, there wasn't something, you didn't get to do something, you didn't get to have a last conversation with somebody, you didn't get to hug them. Like there can be, just sometimes just absolutely tragic stories. I mean, we didn't get that with my brother. I did not get to do that with him. And that can really take a toll on us where we didn't get to our body did not get to do what it wanted to do. We didn't get to have that healing closure with the person. I'm talking obviously specifically about losing somebody. But we can go back and we can work with that and work with what is stuck and do a lot of work with somatic experiencing and hypnosis to imagine allowing ourselves to have a different outcome, a different experience where we do get to have closure and speak to somebody or embrace them. And that can be really, really healing.
Yeah, it sounds very powerful as well.
It is.
So
Yeah.
I think I guess the question that comes to mind as you're saying that is how does a person recognize that they have that stuck grief? I mean, as you mentioned, you're not the same
Mhm.
person. I know in my life and probably in yours as well, when people suffer a loss, I've had people say to me, well, when am I going to feel like I did before this happened? And my answer is,
Yeah.
you aren't. I mean, you're a different person, and many things about you have changed now, and hopefully not all for the bad. But how does a person recognize, I really need to, I mean, I can, in some of the losses, I can say, well, I wish I had done this, or I wish I had a chance to do this, and so on, but I don't know that I would equate that to being stuck in grief.
Mhm. Yeah, right. I think it's so personal too. But I think that this stuckness is generally if they're coming to see me or if they're coming to see a therapist because their grief is not allowing, like they can't function very well. It's like they're not able to move forward. Maybe it's, inhibiting them from, if they lost a spouse, maybe it's inhibiting them from moving forward. And maybe there's a part of them that wants to find somebody else, but there's another part of them that just will not allow it because of the grief is just too heavy, and if it's been like 10 years or something, it's like, okay, this is now something's got to change. There's something in here that's stuck that we need to see if we can work with to try to heal and make some progress with. um, so I think it's when there's sort of this polarization between like, oh my gosh, I I I feel this grief, but I can't move forward in my life, and but I want to move forward in my life, where there's a desire to, but you feel like something is keeping you stuck,
Mhm.
right? I think that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, as you explained it like that, like that completely makes sense to me.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
do you want to talk about any of the other modalities that you work with clients?
Well, somatic experiencing and IFS are like the two main modalities I work with in terms of coaching. And I could offer something for people who are dealing with grief. A lot of my work is very much using the imagination and our powers of being able to visualize. So if somebody is experiencing a lot of grief, a great way to honor it and to be with it so that it doesn't just take you out. Because I know in my experience, I mean, grief can be so heavy and overwhelming that it kind of takes me out where I'm just kind of I'm overwhelmed by it. But what you could try and what I might guide a client through is asking them, if your grief had an image, what would that image be? And then, some people may imagine like an actual mountain, or they could imagine uh, a huge temple or a church or something. And it's often something that's very big
Yeah,
because that's often how the grief feels.
yeah,
So then I would say, all right, can you imagine sitting with that image? And it may be even an image that you return to and you imagine like coming to it to pay respect to it. And the point of it is to differentiate yourself so that you can be in relationship with your grief, without being totally blended and overwhelmed by it. So you can sit with it and you can honor just how big it is and everything that it has endured. But you also get to maintain some boundary with it, right? Where you're with it and honoring it, but also able to be who you are, outside of all of that as well. And that's very much bringing in some somatic and IFS technique, that differentiating and being in relationship to the feeling.
Mm.
Uh, it can it can be really comforting as well for people to have something that they go to, like that exercise, as a way to really pay respect to their grief.
Yeah, because it's not something you ever really, God, I hate to use the word get over, but or whatever, but get used to. I had somebody once use the analogy of grief being it's going to be with you forever. So just pull up
Mhm.
a chair at the table and coexist and find a way to be
Mhm.
at peace with that because it's always going to be there. And that image in my head was always like, oh, actually that makes sense to me too because it's we can't bury it. We can't bury it and say, oh, I'd like to eliminate that memory out and we could go on with that, whatever. And it does definitely change us into different people. I know,
Oh,
speaking for myself, I know for sure.
right. I mean, it changed me completely as a person. All of the loss that I've gone through, and it made me so much more sensitive. I mean, I think because of the fact that I was born to a woman who was grieving during her entire pregnancy with me, and then often throughout my childhood and my teen years. I mean, my mother was often grieving in pretty major ways, and she lost a son. So I mean, but it made me extremely sensitive to people. And I think for me, what the transformation of like the evolution of my grief has been, like the extreme has dropped, where it's not as extreme, and now I get to see how it has rippled through my personality and changed me in ways that I really appreciate today, like my ability to be sensitive to people and to attune to them, to be that person that other people can sit with when they are grieving, who really can hold space. Uh, yeah, I think that like there are things that we know, like when we're in this kind of club, right? Like when you have gone through grief, when you've gone through, everybody has gone through grief, but I think there are also even specific kinds of grief. Uh, there are ways in which we kind of recognize each other. Like you can tell when somebody has gone through something similar, right? In those moments, like when you're going through a loss, there's just a way that you sit with somebody. There's a way that you look at them and you speak with them that is so comforting. And I am grateful that I can often be that person.
Yeah, it's kind of I consider it a gift, really, and I
Mhm.
hate to say that personally because it's a gift I don't think I would have opted for. But
Yeah.
as an example, I recently had a coworker share with me that she'd had a close friend commit suicide.
Mm.
Having had that loss myself in my life with my first husband,
Mhm.
I immediately went into exactly what you're talking about. Let's talk. What do you want to tell me, and so on, and just that. Whereas a lot of people want, especially when it comes to suicide or drugs or whatever, people just they close down. They don't want to talk about it. It's an ugly loss. It's not admirable, whatever. And but
Oh,
it doesn't matter the person left behind. They're still grieving, and even more so because of the stigma in some cases.
yeah, that's, oh gosh, I just like even am like cringing inside just when you're telling me that somebody might have that reaction, because it's like it's such a tender time. And I have so much respect for people who do take their own lives, because I know that I have been at the edge myself. And I know that when somebody is there and they do that, that person is really suffering. And yeah, it's like I can't imagine, if somebody shared that with me, I would feel so much tenderness and care, and I yeah, and non-judgment towards that person and their choice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But you're right. There is so much stigma around those issues, and it's really a shame. That's where a therapy modality like internal family systems is really useful, because we see suicidality and addiction as protective, as defense mechanisms. That's a person who is desperately trying to protect themselves, and those are also destructive defense mechanisms, but they, I mean, but they're also, but really, like at the heart of what somebody is trying to do is they are desperately trying to help themselves. And there's just a tremendous amount of pain inside. So yeah, I really appreciate IFS for helping to create more of that compassionate lens. Because it's the truth. It's not selfish. These are really people that are just trying to survive and are having a hard time.
I completely agree with you. Completely agree with
Yeah.
you. I've also been on that ledge myself at times in my life, and
Mhm.
can
Yeah.
understand what that feels like too. So I know we're going to be putting a link in our podcast notes to your website. And anything else you'd like us to link for listeners that might be helpful. But is there anything else you'd like to share before we end today?
I just appreciate you having me come on to have this conversation, and I'm just wishing any of your listeners, healing and growth, and to let everybody know that they're not alone. And I hope this conversation was helpful in some way.
Great. Sasha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.